You're not part of this trip. You're not part of any of it anymore.
That's my ticket, Serena.
Was.
Sure. Time to go, sweetheart.
You never belonged in that seat anyway.
What Serena didn't realize as she walked into that jet bridge on his arm was that the seat she'd just taken from me was already the least important thing she was about to lose. What was really waiting for her on that plane? If you've ever watched someone underestimate you and said nothing, this story is for you. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. I didn't grow up dreaming about corner offices or company cars. What I wanted from the time I was old enough to take apart a broken radio and put it back together was to build something that actually worked. Something real. Something that helped people. That's why I spent 7 years at a biomedical engineering firm in Portland, designing sterilization equipment for operating rooms. Not for the title, not for the salary, but because I knew that if one of those systems failed, someone on a table somewhere would pay for it. That kind of weight keeps you honest. Serena came into my life during a hospital supply conference in downtown Portland. She was working for a vendor, moving through the room like she'd already memorized everyone's names and budgets before she arrived. She had that rare ability to walk into a conversation midway through and make both people feel like she was exactly who they'd been waiting to talk to. I watched her for 20 minutes before she turned around and introduced herself. By the end of the evening, she'd talked me into explaining the entire sterilization monitoring problem I'd been trying to solve for 2 years. By the end of the following week, she had called 3 hospital procurement directors to ask if they'd ever pay for a solution. All 3 said yes. That was the beginning of Overheard Medical Systems. Not in a boardroom, not with lawyers present in my garage, with a whiteboard covered in my handwriting, and Serena sitting on a folding chair asking questions sharp enough to cut glass. I built the first prototype using money from my savings account. I signed the guarantee on the initial business loan with my own name on the line. When the company was formally incorporated, I was listed as co-founder with 35% equity, and the core patent, the automated tracking system for surgical room equipment, was filed under my name, with Overheard holding a licensing right to commercialize it during the marriage. At the time, it felt like the kind of technicality that didn't matter, because everything we were building was ours together. Then Claire was born, and everything shifted in the way that only a sick child can shift your priorities without warning. Our daughter spent her first 2 years with health problems that kept one of us in the hospital at least twice a month. Serena was the one building client relationships, traveling to pitch meetings, closing contracts that kept the lights on. It made sense for me to step back from day-to-day operations and be the parent who was home, the one the doctors called, the one who knew which medications made her sleep and which ones made her cry. I didn't see it as a sacrifice. I saw it as a different kind of work. What I didn't see, what I was too close to notice, was how completely I was disappearing from the story Serena was telling about Overheard. By the time Claire was healthy enough to start school, Serena had become the public face of the company in a way that had quietly crowded me out of the frame. Magazine profiles called her a self-made entrepreneur. Investor presentations showed a founding timeline that started with Serena's first pitch meeting, not my garage. My name still appeared in the legal documents, but it had stopped appearing in any conversation that mattered. I told myself it didn't bother me. I was still doing real work, reviewing technical files, consulting on safety certifications, troubleshooting the engineering problems that nobody else at the company could solve. Serena knew that. The engineering team knew that. I thought that was enough. Derek Vaughn joined Overheard as Chief Operating Officer about 3 years ago. He was polished in the way that people who've spent their careers in corporate boardrooms tend to be polished. Never a wrong word, never a visible edge, always exactly as confident as the room required him to be. Serena introduced him at the team meeting as the person who would take Overheard to the next level, which was the kind of phrase that should have told me more than it did. I shook his hand. I thought he seemed competent. The first time I noticed something I couldn't explain away, we were at the company's anniversary dinner. Derek reached across the back of Serena's chair during a conversation with an investor, and left his hand there on her shoulder for a few seconds longer than any professional relationship called for. Serena didn't flinch. She didn't shift away. She kept talking, and she introduced Derek as the man who was really driving the future of the company. Not her husband of 12 years. Not the engineer who built the thing she was selling. I drove home alone that night. Serena stayed to finish the event. I sat in the kitchen for a long time without turning on the lights, and I thought about all the small things I had written off over the previous months. The closed office door when Derek called the business trips that stretched a day longer than the agenda required. The way she talked about the Boston meeting, like it was the most important thing in the company's history, and somehow also none of my concern. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I went to bed. I was wrong to wait, but I wasn't wrong to watch. The night I found out the truth was a Tuesday. Serena had stepped out of the kitchen to take a call, and she left her tablet on the counter face up. I wasn't trying to look. I was making coffee. The notification came through on the screen while I was standing 2 feet away, and it was from Derek, and it said, "After Boston, we won't have to keep pretending anymore." I stood there for a long moment looking at the ceiling, then at the tablet, then at the hallway where I could hear Serena's voice still rising and falling on her call. I picked up the tablet and opened the message thread. What I read in the next 10 minutes was not primarily about an affair, though the affair was there and it had been going on for nearly 2 years. What I read was a plan, a detailed, deliberate 3-part plan. Serena was negotiating the sale of Oraline Medical Systems to a company called Eastgate Health Partners. The deal price was $86 million. Before the transaction closed, she intended to transfer the core patents out of Oraline and into a new subsidiary, stripping the company of its most valuable asset before the acquisition was finalized. Derek was coordinating the operational side. Serena's sister, Bethany Crane, a corporate attorney, was handling the paperwork. The paperwork included a document showing that I had voluntarily relinquished my 35% stake 3 years ago in exchange for a symbolic payment. There was a scanned signature on that document that looked like mine. I had never signed anything of the sort. There was one line in the email thread that I read 3 times before I put the tablet down. It said, "We just need him to lose control once in front of a witness." I set the tablet back on the counter in exactly the position I'd found it. Then I went upstairs and stood in the doorway of Claire's room. She was asleep. She had one of those small plastic models of a sterilization unit on her bookshelf. I'd built it with her for a school science project the previous spring, a miniature version of the first device I'd ever designed. She was 10 years old. She had no idea that by the time she woke up, her father understood exactly how much he was about to lose. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my desk and I thought through the situation as carefully as I could, the way an engineer thinks through a system failure, not from the emotion of it, but from the structure. What I kept returning to was not the affair. The affair was its own kind of damage, and I would eventually have to sit with what it meant that the woman I had built a life with had been lying to me for 2 years. But that was a wound for later. What demanded my attention right now was the mechanism. Serena needed me to react. Every step of the plan she'd built with Derek and Bethany depended on me behaving like a man who couldn't control himself, angry enough to threaten, unstable enough to discredit, predictable enough to trap. The profile she was building for the custody filing described me as volatile and unemployable. The airport scene, whatever it was going to be, was designed to produce footage. If I gave her one moment of exactly the behavior she was expecting, she could use it everywhere in court with the board, with Eastgate's legal team. And the cruelest part of it was that she wasn't wrong to expect it. Most people in my position would have walked into exactly that reaction without realizing they were stepping into something that had been built for them. So I made a decision. I was not going to give it to her. The following morning, I called Yvonne Ellis. I'd been referred to her 2 years earlier by a colleague who'd gone through a shareholder dispute, and I'd kept her number the way you keep a number you hope you'll never use. Yvonne was a specialist in intellectual property litigation and corporate fraud, not divorce law, which I knew was intentional on her part. She had the kind of manner that made you feel like she'd already thought of everything you were about to say. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me where the original patent filing documents were stored. We met in her office the following day. She'd spent the night reviewing the incorporation documents I'd sent her, and she laid out the situation in terms that were clear enough to be brutal. The core patent had never been fully assigned to Auraline. The licensing agreement that existed gave the company rights to commercialize the technology during the course of the marriage, but I remained a co-owner of the underlying intellectual property. Any sale of that technology required my written consent. Without it, the transaction was legally compromised from the moment it closed, and Eastgate, as the acquiring party, would be the one holding the liability. The relinquishment document Serena had prepared was the load-bearing wall of the entire scheme. If it was valid, she could argue I had no remaining stake and the sale could proceed. If it wasn't, if the signature was fabricated, the whole structure came down. Yvonne told me she'd already contacted a forensic document examiner and needed 48 hours to get preliminary results on the file metadata. She also told me I had two choices. I could confront Serena directly, which would almost certainly cause her to destroy evidence, accelerate the custody filing, and push the Boston signing to an earlier date. Or I could do nothing visible. Let her believe the plan was on track. Let Derek keep showing up at my house with documents that needed Serena's signature. Let him set his phone on the kitchen counter at the angle he thought was subtle. Let Serena keep calling me her stay-at-home husband in front of the management team. Use every day I had to build the case that she had no idea I was building. I chose silence, and I chose it without hesitation. The next 6 weeks were the strangest of my life. I made breakfast every morning. I drove Claire to school. I showed up at 2 company events where Serena introduced me to people who looked at me the way people look at furniture, politely, briefly, without any expectation that I would say something worth remembering. I smiled. I shook hands. I came home and sat at my desk and spent the evenings working through documents with Yvonne, building a file that grew heavier every week. The original prototype schematics with my name and the date on every page. The engineering development journal I'd kept from the first month of the company's existence. The founding agreement that confirmed my equity stake. Email threads from Serena that showed she'd been aware of the patent ownership structure as recently as 14 months ago. The metadata trail from the relinquishment document, which confirmed it had been created on a laptop registered to Bethany Crane, last edited on a network registered to Derek's office suite, and uploaded to Auraline's internal document storage only, 11 weeks before the Boston meeting, not 3 years ago, as Serena was claiming. Yvonne also began making careful inquiries with Margaret Sutter, the woman leading the acquisition team at Eastgate. She didn't ask Margaret to take my side. She raised a single legal question: if the core asset in an $86 million transaction had an unresolved ownership dispute, who would bear the liability once the contracts were signed? Margaret agreed to meet me. She arranged it quietly without telling Serena or anyone on the Auraline side. We sat across from each other in a conference room at a hotel in Portland, and she put 3 questions on the table about the engineering architecture of the sterilization monitoring system. Questions specific enough that they couldn't be answered with a pitch deck or a product brochure. I answered all 3. I also described a structural flaw in the second version of the device, a calibration error that the engineering team had caught and corrected before any units shipped. That flaw had never been documented in any official file. It existed only in my original handwritten journal and in my memory. Margaret studied me for a moment after I finished, and then she said she would be on the same flight to Boston that Serena had booked for the signing. She would be in seat 1A. What Serena had planned for that airport was a performance. She had told Derek in one of those emails that they just needed me to lose control once in front of a witness. She was counting on the fact that any man standing at a boarding gate watching his wife hand his ticket to her lover would do exactly that. The night before the flight, I stood in Claire's doorway for a long time. She was working on a small project at her desk, bending over the pieces with the kind of focused patience that reminded me of myself at that age. I watched her without saying anything. She looked up, saw me, and went back to her work. Just a normal evening. Just her father standing in the door. I went to bed. I set my alarm. I thought about the 2 torn pieces of a boarding pass that I already knew I was going to pick up off the floor of Gate 14 the following afternoon, and I thought about how important it was that when the moment came, my face showed absolutely nothing. Serena needed me to lose control once. I had spent 6 weeks making sure that when she finally made her move, I would be the calmest person in that terminal. The 6 weeks between the night I read those messages and the morning of the Boston flight were not 6 weeks of waiting. They were 6 weeks of performance, and I say that without any sense of pride in it because performing normalcy when you know what you know is one of the most exhausting things a person can do. Derek came to the house 4 times during that period, always with some reason that involved paperwork Serena needed to sign. The first time I answered the door and offered him coffee. He declined with the smile of a man who finds it amusing that you don't know what he knows. I noticed the phone. He'd set it on the kitchen counter while waiting for Serena, angled toward the doorway where I was standing with the screen dark in a way that didn't match how bright the room was. I understood immediately what it was for. I leaned against the counter, crossed my arms, and talked to him about the Portland weather until Serena came downstairs. He didn't get anything useful that day, or any of the days that followed. There was one evening when he pushed harder. Serena had stepped out to take a call, and Derek was sitting at my kitchen table, and he looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as deliberate. He said he hoped I understood that the Boston deal was going to change things significantly for Oraline, and that the transition would go much more smoothly for everyone if I stayed out of the way. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said I appreciated the update and asked if he wanted more water. His jaw tightened slightly. He glanced at the phone on the counter. I had not raised my voice. I had not moved toward him. There was nothing on that recording he could use. What Serena was building during those weeks beyond the legal machinery was a reputation. She told the management team I'd been struggling emotionally with the transition away from the company. She mentioned to at least 2 board members that my behavior had become unpredictable. She filed paperwork internally that reclassified my consulting role as terminated without telling me because she expected the Boston deal to close before I had any reason to look. At one point, my access card to the engineering lab simply stopped working. I stood at the door for 10 seconds, then went home and called Yvonne to tell her. She added it to the file. Every morning I made Claire's breakfast. Every evening I sat at my desk. The 2 stacks of paper in front of me, one being built by Serena, one being built by me, grew at roughly the same rate, and I knew the only question was which one would be standing when everything came down. The day of the flight, I was at the airport 2 hours early. Serena had texted that morning to say the car was leaving at noon and I should be ready. She'd framed the whole trip as a chance for us to reconnect her word, which told me the performance I was about to watch had been choreographed well in advance. I took my own car to Portland International and checked in at the counter without telling her I was already there. I was sitting near the window at gate 14 when Serena arrived. She came through the terminal corridor with her rolling bag, talking on her phone, and she didn't see me at first. Then Derek appeared from the direction of the coffee kiosk, and the way they moved together, the small adjustment of proximity, the ease of it confirmed everything I already knew in a way that the emails somehow hadn't quite finished doing. Serena spotted me, and her expression reset into something composed and slightly surprised. She walked over and asked if I'd checked in, and I said yes. She nodded in the way that people nod when they're calculating something. Derek stood a few feet back looking at his phone. The boarding announcement came. The line began forming, and then Serena reached over and pulled my boarding pass out of my hand before I'd processed what was happening. She tore it in half with one clean motion, the kind of motion you make when you've rehearsed it. Her voice when she spoke carried just far enough for the people around us to hear. She said I wasn't part of this trip anymore. She said I wasn't part of the company anymore. Then she held out my first-class ticket to Derek, and he took it with the ease of someone receiving something that had always belonged to him, and they walked toward the jet bridge together. The people around us went quiet. I could feel the attention the way you feel a change in air pressure. Everyone was waiting. I understood in that moment exactly what the scene was designed to produce, and I understood that Derek's phone was no longer on a counter at my house, but somewhere on his person pointed at me, waiting for the moment. I would confirm every word Serena had been saying about me to the board for the past 2 months. I crouched down and picked up both torn halves of the boarding pass from the floor. I folded them together and put them in my jacket pocket. Then I took out my phone and called Margaret Sutter. The call lasted under 2 minutes. Margaret had anticipated this possibility. Yvonne had briefed her and her assistant had already coordinated with the airline. 7 minutes after I made the call, a gate agent walked over and handed me a new boarding pass. Seat 2A. The switch had been arranged in advance quietly through channels that had nothing to do with Serena or anyone connected to her. I boarded last. I walked through the first-class cabin and found Serena and Derek sitting together, her in the window seat, him in the aisle. Both of them settled with the particular satisfaction of people who believe the hardest part is behind them. Serena looked up when I passed, and her expression went through several things in quick succession: surprise, then calculation, then something that was trying very hard to be contempt and not quite landing. I sat down in seat 2. One row behind them, buckled my belt, and looked out the window. I did not look at her again during boarding. What changed Serena's expression from careful management to genuine alarm was not my presence on the plane. It was what happened about 10 minutes after we'd leveled off, when the flight attendant leaned forward toward the first row and asked Margaret Sutter if she needed anything before the service began. Serena turned her head at the name and found herself looking at the woman who controlled the fate of an $86 million acquisition sitting in seat 1. 12 inches in front of her on the same plane she had chosen on a flight she had believed was under her complete control. I had watched Serena handle surprises for 12 years. She was good at it. She had the kind of mind that could absorb an unexpected variable and rebuild around it faster than most people could recognize that anything had changed. But this was not a variable she could rebuild around, because the damage wasn't in the room yet. It was in what Margaret already knew, what Yvonne had already sent her, what I had already answered across a table in Portland 3 days ago. The surprise at Gate 14 had been the visible part. The real work had been done long before Serena stepped onto this plane. I watched her face process the geography of the situation, the woman she needed to control, sitting 1 row ahead of the husband she'd tried to leave behind, and I watched her understand for the first time that the ground she thought she was standing on had already shifted. Then I looked back out the window. For the rest of the flight, Serena tried twice to speak with Margaret. Both times, Margaret responded politely and briefly and returned to whatever she was reading. Derek spent most of the flight composing messages to Bethany, his posture tightening by degrees as the silence from Margaret's direction continued. Whatever plan they were assembling it in real time, which told me they had not been expecting this particular development. By the time we landed in Boston, they had recovered enough to move forward. That was the thing about Serena. She didn't stop. She adjusted, and she moved. I had watched her do it for 12 years in business contexts, and I understood it as a strength. Facing it directed at me was different, but it wasn't a surprise. Within 2 hours of arriving at the hotel, Serena had filed a complaint with the Oraline Board of Directors. The complaint described me as attempting to interfere with a legitimate business transaction out of personal grievance related to our marriage. It stated that I had no current role at the company, no standing to participate in the signing, and that my presence in Boston was evidence of a pattern of harassment. Derek provided the footage from the airport to support the filing, but the version he provided was edited. It began after Serena had already torn the ticket and handed it to him, cutting the part where her hands were on my boarding pass. What remained was a clip of me standing at the gate with a neutral expression while the two of them walked away, which without context looked exactly like what Serena's complaint said it looked like. Bethany had also arrived in Boston. She entered the picture at the hotel with a folder of documents that she presented to Eastgate's legal team as a complete record of my former equity position. The centerpiece was the relinquishment agreement, the document bearing what appeared to be my signature, 2 witness signatures, and a notary stamp. One of the witness signatures belonged to Paul Dreyer, a man I'd worked alongside in the early days of Oraline, someone I'd considered a genuine friend. Seeing his name on that page landed differently than everything else because Paul was not part of the scheme. Yvonne had already reached him before we left Portland, and what he told her was straightforward and sad. Bethany had called him and said it was a routine internal restructuring form, that she just needed someone who could confirm my identity from the founding period, and that it would take 5 minutes. Paul had signed without reading it. He hadn't known what he was confirming. I had not known my signature wasn't real. The Eastgate legal team reviewed the document and reached a conclusion that was professionally cautious but practically devastating. They could not rule out its validity on the spot. The notary stamp appeared legitimate on its face. The witnesses were real people with verifiable identities. Without a completed forensic analysis, they were not in a position to advise Eastgate to walk away from the transaction on the basis of a disputed claim. Margaret told me privately before the formal pre-signing session began that if I didn't have conclusive evidence to present the following morning, she would be compelled to allow the process to continue. She said it without apology and without cruelty. She was doing her job. That was the moment Serena's third move arrived. Yvonne called me that evening in my hotel room to tell me that a custody motion had been filed in Multnomah County Family Court earlier that afternoon. Serena was requesting temporary sole guardianship of Claire on the grounds that I had abandoned my child by traveling to Boston to interfere in a business proceeding and harass my wife. The motion included a declaration describing my mental and emotional state as deteriorating over the previous year. It cited my unemployment, my pattern of hostile behavior toward company staff, and my presence at the airport gate as an example of threatening and erratic conduct. She had used the airport scene to file for my daughter. She had planned for exactly this, and she had executed it while I was sitting 37,000 feet in the air. Yvonne was careful in the way she raised the next part. She said that Serena's attorneys had communicated through an intermediary that there was a path to avoiding the custody proceeding. If I agreed to a confidential settlement withdrawing all claims against the relinquishment document, releasing any dispute over the patent transfer, and signing a non-disclosure agreement about the circumstances surrounding the transaction, Serena would withdraw the custody motion. I would keep my relationship with Claire. The deal would close. Everything would be quiet. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed for a long time after the call ended. I thought about Claire at her desk the night before I left, bent over her project, the small, focused set of her shoulders. I thought about what it would mean to sign an agreement that said I had never been defrauded, that the document with the false signature was valid, that the technology I had built in my own garage belonged entirely to a company from which I was now excluded. I thought about what Serena would do with that signature over the following years, every time she needed leverage, every time she wanted something from me that I wasn't willing to give. I called Yvonne back. I told her no. She didn't argue. She had expected the answer. She told me to be in the meeting room at the Mariner House by 9 the following morning and that she would be joining remotely. She said the case was strong, but it required every piece of evidence to land cleanly in the right order in front of people who had no particular incentive to believe me over Serena. There was no room for anger. There was no room for the kind of response that Serena had spent 6 weeks trying to provoke at my kitchen counter and at Gate 14 and in every other moment she could engineer. She said, "You need to walk in there the same way you walked out of that airport." I told her I understood. I set my phone on the nightstand and looked out at the Boston skyline, dark and indifferent, and I thought about how the most important room was still in front of me. Everything I needed was already built. All I had to do was walk in and let it speak. I didn't sleep well, but I didn't expect to. I lay in the hotel room with the lights of Boston coming through the gap in the curtains, and I went through the evidence the way I used to go through engineering diagnostics, not searching for reassurance, but looking for the thing I might have missed. By 4 in the morning, I was satisfied that I hadn't missed anything. By 6, I was dressed. By 8, I was sitting in the lobby of the Mariner House with a cup of coffee. I didn't finish watching the elevator doors. The meeting room was on the top floor, a long table with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the harbor, the kind of room designed to make transactions feel significant. When I arrived, Eastgate's legal team was already seated on one side of the table. Margaret was at the head reviewing something on her tablet. Serena came in 2 minutes later with Derek and Bethany behind her. She was wearing the gray blazer she always wore to closings. She looked composed and formidable and completely certain that what was about to happen was a formality. She looked at me across the table and I watched her decide in real time to treat my presence as an irritant rather than a threat. That decision told me everything about how confident she still was at that moment. Margaret opened the session by stating that before the signing proceeded, there was a legal matter requiring formal presentation. She nodded toward the screen at the end of the room, and Yvonne appeared on the video call, composed her files organized in front of her with the particular stillness of someone who has been preparing for a specific 10 minutes for a very long time. Serena's attorney began to object, citing proper notice requirements, but Margaret held up a hand and said the objection was noted and would be addressed after the presentation. Bethany's expression 2 seats down from Serena shifted into something careful and guarded. Derek looked at his phone under the table. Yvonne began with the relinquishment document. She did not open with accusations. She opened with data. The forensic examination of the file had produced a metadata record showing the document had been created on a laptop registered to Bethany Crane. It had been last accessed and modified on a network assigned to Derek Vaughn's office suite at Auraline's Portland headquarters. And it had been uploaded to Auraline's internal document storage system 11 weeks before the scheduled Boston closing not 3 years ago, as the document's date claimed. One of Eastgate's attorneys leaned forward and asked about the notary stamp. Yvonne had been waiting for that question. The notary whose seal appeared on the document had surrendered her license to the Oregon Notary Commission 6 months before the date printed on the page. The stamp itself was real. The license behind it was not. Yvonne then presented the written statement from Paul Dreyer. She summarized it without editorial comment. Paul had been contacted by Bethany Crane, told the document was a routine administrative form related to the founding period of Auraline, and asked to sign as a witness confirming identity. He had signed. He had not read the document. He had not been told it was a relinquishment of equity. He had not known that the signature attributed to me was fabricated. Paul was not in Boston. He was in Portland, and his statement had been notarized 2 days before the flight. Serena's attorney said the statement was unverified and self-serving. Yvonne said the original sworn affidavit was available to all parties within the hour. Then I spoke. I had asked Yvonne in advance if I could handle this portion myself, because the materials I was presenting were mine in a way that no legal summary could quite convey. I laid the prototype schematics on the table, the originals, not copies, with my signature and date on every sheet. The earliest one dated more than 13 years ago, drawn in my own hand in a garage in northeast Portland. I set beside them the Engineering Development Journal, a composition notebook with a cracked spine, and 147 pages of handwritten entries documenting every iteration of the technology from the initial concept through the final commercial version. I placed the original patent filing documents next to those co-inventor listed first, licensing rights granted to Auraline Medical Systems for the duration of the marriage, full ownership not transferred. I told the room that Auraline could not legally sell this technology without my written consent. I told them the consent had never been given. I told them the document claiming otherwise had been created, recently signed with a fabricated version of my name and witnessed by a man who had been deceived about what he was signing. The room was quiet for a moment, in the way that rooms go quiet when something complicated becomes simple. Serena stood up. She did not look at me when she began talking. She looked at Margaret and at the Eastgate attorneys, and she spoke about the hundreds of people employed by Auraline, about the years she had spent building something from nothing, about what it meant that her own husband was willing to destroy all of it because he couldn't accept that she had moved on. She said the word jealousy. She said the word vindictive. She said she had tried to protect me, had tried to include me, had tried to give me a dignified exit from a company where I no longer had a productive role, and that this, what I was doing in this room, was the behavior of a man who would rather burn everything down than let his wife succeed without him. It was a strong speech. I had expected something like it, and I had thought carefully about how to respond. And what I had decided was that the most important thing I could say was also the shortest. I told her I wasn't there to talk about who she had chosen to love. I was there because the signature on that document was not mine, because the patent transfer had been executed without my knowledge or consent, and because she had filed a custody motion describing me as an unfit parent, using footage that had been deliberately edited to remove the part where she tore my boarding pass out of my hand. Those were not the actions of a woman giving her husband a dignified exit. Those were the actions of someone trying to make sure he couldn't speak. Margaret told Serena to sit down. What happened next was quieter than I might have imagined during those 6 weeks in Portland, and in some ways, worse to watch. Derek, apparently calculating that the situation had shifted beyond recovery, told Eastgate's legal team that he had been acting on instructions from Bethany in his capacity as COO, that he had not independently verified the provenance of the documents, and that his role had been purely operational. He said it with the same careful smoothness he brought to every room, as if he were describing someone else's decisions. Bethany turned and looked at him with an expression I won't forget. She opened her folder and removed a printed email chain. She said she had specific written instructions sent from Derek's company account directing her to prepare the relinquishment document using my signature from the 2014 licensing agreement to backdate it to 3 years prior and to have it notarized before the Boston meeting. She placed the printed emails on the table and pushed them toward Eastgate's attorneys. Derek said that was not accurate. Bethany said she had the originals on her laptop and was prepared to share them with any investigative authority that requested them. The quality of Derek's composure, which had always been the most unsettling thing about him, finally cracked not into anger, but into a kind of rapid, blinking silence that was almost worse to see. Margaret let the room settle for a moment. Then she said that Eastgate Health Partners was withdrawing from the transaction effective immediately. She said the full documentation package, the metadata analysis, the forensic report, Paul Dreyer's affidavit, the email chain, and all related materials would be transmitted to the Oregon Department of Justice and the Securities Division within 48 hours. The signing session ended without a single signature. The consequences that followed happened quickly, the way consequences tend to when the underlying structure collapses all at once. Within 72 hours, the $86 million transaction was formally canceled. The Oraline Board of Directors voted to suspend Serena from her CEO position pending an internal investigation. Derek was terminated that same day and placed under inquiry by the Oregon Financial Crimes Unit for his role in falsifying corporate records. Bethany faced a disciplinary proceeding before the state bar with her license to practice law frozen while the investigation was ongoing. A court order was issued placing all pending patent transfers on hold, preserving my ownership position until the legal process could establish the full record. The custody motion was dismissed. The judge reviewing it had access to the complete airport surveillance footage, not Derek's edited clip, but the full security camera record from Gate 14, which showed Serena reaching across and taking my boarding pass, tearing it in half and handing it to Derek while I stood still. Derek left Boston on his own the evening after the meeting. He didn't wait for Serena. He booked a separate flight and was gone before dinner. The partnership that was supposed to begin after Boston lasted exactly as long as the money did. I did not ask for Oraline to be shut down. There were engineers on that team who had spent years building something real. There were administrative staff and service technicians and logistics people who had nothing to do with what Serena and Derek had planned. The technology worked. The product helped hospitals. None of those people deserved to lose their positions because of decisions made in a hotel room in Boston. I agreed to allow Oraline to continue operating under an independent board of directors, subject to a full financial audit and the restoration of my recognized ownership stake in the underlying patents. Serena found me 3 weeks after I returned to Portland. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me she hadn't understood how far things had gone, that Derek had been the driving force, that it had evolved into something she hadn't fully sanctioned. When she finished, I told her that Derek may have suggested the strategy, but that she had approved it, coordinated it, and filed a custody declaration designed to take Claire away from a father who had done nothing to deserve losing her. I told her I didn't think Derek could sign her name. I told her I didn't think Derek had called Paul Dreyer and described a fraud as a routine HR form. Those were her choices made with her voice, and the fact that someone she trusted had encouraged them didn't transfer the weight of them to him. She didn't say anything else after that. She left, and I sat at the table for a while in the quiet, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Not relief, not satisfaction, but a kind of clean exhaustion. The feeling of having carried something very heavy for a very long time and finally being allowed to set it down. I filed for divorce the following month and requested a shared custody arrangement based on Claire's school schedule and her own preferences. My attorney made it clear in the filing that I had no intention of using the fraud case as leverage in the custody proceeding. Claire was not a legal instrument. She was a 10-year-old girl who loved both her parents, and the only thing I was willing to fight for in that part of the process was the right to remain consistently present in her life. Serena did not contest the custody arrangement. Claire knew something serious had happened between her parents. Children always know even when they don't have words for it, but she did not hear from me what Serena had done, or what the plan had been, or what the document said. That was not because I wanted to protect Serena's reputation. It was because Claire's relationship with her mother was hers, not evidence, not collateral, not mine to shape for my own comfort. 18 months after Boston, I signed the lease on a small research space in a converted building on the east side of Portland. The focus was what I had always wanted to return to: developing sterilization and monitoring equipment for community hospitals and rural clinics facilities that couldn't afford the high-end systems the major manufacturers produced. The work was smaller in scale than Oraline had been. It was also entirely mine. My name was on the door, not as someone's husband, not as a co-founder listed in a legal document that nobody read. On the door, in the kind of lettering that doesn't apologize for being there. Claire started coming by after school 2 or 3 times a week. She had her own spot, a small table near the window with a lamp she'd picked out herself, and she would sit there doing homework while I worked at the bench across the room. Sometimes she asked questions about what I was doing. Sometimes she just sat in the quiet. The easy companionship of it was something I hadn't known I was missing until it was simply there without anyone needing to arrange it or approve it. One afternoon, she looked up from her notebook and asked whether I regretted going to Boston. I went to the drawer where I kept the 2 torn halves of the Gate 14 boarding pass. I took them out and set them side by side on the work table, the torn edges meeting in the middle. I told Claire that some doors only open after someone else has tried to close them in your face, and that the flight to Boston had been one of those doors. She looked at the 2 pieces for a moment and went back to her homework. That was enough for her. It was enough for me, too. Serena drove past the building one evening not long after. She had slowed down and looked through the window, seen Claire and me at our respective tables, and driven on without stopping. I don't know what she thought about during those few seconds. What I know is that she had looked at my stillness for 12 years and read it as passivity. She had looked at my silence and read it as ignorance. She had looked at the work I'd done in the background, the patents, the prototypes, the late nights, the years of showing up for Claire when Serena was building her public story, and decided it was the kind of thing you could erase with a forged signature and a well-edited video clip. She had been wrong about all of it, not because I was more powerful than she thought, but because the things she had tried to take from me were never actually hers to take. The lab was quiet in the evenings. The work was real, and for the first time in longer than I could easily remember, everything I was building at the end of the day was still there in the morning, belonging to no one but me. There's something I've come to believe after everything that happened: staying calm in the moment someone is trying to break you is not weakness. It's the hardest thing you can do, and sometimes it's the only thing that actually protects what matters. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever had to hold yourself together when someone was counting on you to fall apart, I think you'll find more stories here that speak to that. Subscribe and stay with this channel. There are more voices here worth hearing.